Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The rain had been falling since midnight, turning the Luzon Ridge into a long stretch of wet soil and slick roots. Corporal Elias Ward moved through it with steady, deliberate steps, keeping his weight close to the ground so he wouldn't make noise. His uniform clung to his skin, and the cold water dripping from the leaves soaked through his collar. He stayed alert, scanning each tree line and listening for anything out of place. Elias wasn't a typical scout. His commanders used him for long, silent reconnaissance because he didn't rely on a rifle. Instead, he carried a handmade longbow, oiled wood, a weathered string, and a quiver of arrows treated for humidity. Most of the unit joked about it, calling it a weapon from another century. Elias let them talk. He trusted it more than anything else he carried. Rifles jammed. Ammunition ran out. The bow didn't fail him, not since the day he saw his younger brother die during a rescue attempt that spiraled out of control. Every time he touched a rifle after that, his hands shook. The bow steadied him in a way nothing else could. His mission that morning was simple on paper: scout the ridge, confirm enemy movement, and report. No backup, no partner. He was used to that. The jungle was easier to deal with than the noise of other soldiers and the questions that followed him everywhere. He reached a small wooden supply hut marked faintly on his map. The structure was old, slanted roof, warped boards, a door barely hanging on its hinges. He approached slowly, an arrow ready in his hand. There were no footprints outside, no recent signs of life. But something felt off. The air inside the hut was too still, too warm, as if someone had been breathing in there recently. When he stepped inside, his eyes adjusted to the dim light. Damp air settled over the room. He scanned the interior. Empty crates, rotting fabric, scattered leaves blown in from the broken door. At first, he didn't see her. Then he noticed a shape curled near the far wall. A woman. Japanese uniform shirt. Bare legs covered in cuts. Hair matted to her forehead. Skin pale and damp with fever. She lay on her side, clutching a small notebook against her chest with both hands. The tension in her knuckles showed how tightly she was holding onto it. Elias lowered the arrow and studied her carefully. Her breathing was shallow, her lips cracked. Fever, dehydration. She was conscious enough to sense someone near her. Her fingers twitched around the notebook. When her eyes opened, she reacted instantly. Fear, confusion, and the instinct to protect the thing she was holding. She tried to push herself backward, but her body barely responded. Her voice came out in a weak whisper in Japanese, begging him not to kill her. Elias lifted his hand slowly to show he wasn't preparing to attack. "You're all right," he said quietly. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't trust him. Her breathing sped up. Her shoulders tensed as if she expected him to finish her off at any moment. He hesitated. His orders didn't include helping enemy soldiers. Helping her meant slowing himself down and increasing his risk. Leaving her meant she wouldn't survive another hour. He felt a familiar pressure settle in his chest. The feeling he got whenever he had to choose between safety and doing what he knew was right. He crouched beside her, moved slowly, and took his canteen from his belt. "Here," he said. "Water." He tilted it toward her lips. She jerked away at first, expecting a trick. But when the cold water touched her mouth, instinct took over and she tried to drink. She coughed, swallowed, and reached weakly for more. Elias let her take small sips. Too much would make her sick. She sagged back against the wooden wall, exhausted. The notebook never left her grip. Elias noticed the markings on the cover, coded sequences, transmission symbols. She wasn't infantry. She was a cryptographer. That explained her condition. Cryptographers didn't survive long if they deserted. He lifted her gently and carried her to the driest corner of the hut. She was lighter than he expected, her body weakened from days without safe water or food. She watched him with wide, confused eyes, unsure why an American soldier hadn't ended her life the moment he found her. He dipped a cloth in collected rainwater and placed it on her forehead. She winced at the cold, but didn't resist. Her fever was high, her pulse fast. She needed rest, water, and safety. Elias sat near the entrance, not blocking it, not approaching her any further. He kept enough distance to show she wasn't trapped. His bow lay beside him, arrow ready in case someone else approached the hut. For a long time, neither spoke. The rain softened into a light drizzle, tapping against the roof. She watched him carefully, waiting for signs of aggression. He watched the tree line outside, waiting for patrols. After several minutes, her breathing steadied. Her voice came out weak but clear. "Why help?" Elias kept his eyes on the ridge outside. "Because leaving you out, there wasn't something I could do." She looked at him as if trying to understand the logic. She then lowered her head, exhausted. Her mind was too foggy to process more. Elias stayed awake, listening to every sound outside. Only then did the remaining questions settle into his thoughts. Who was she running from? What was in a notebook? How close were the men hunting her? He didn't voice any of it. The answers would come later, if she survived the night. For now, the shack became a fragile moment of safety for both of them. Two strangers trapped between war, decisions they didn't ask for, and the instinct to keep another human being alive, even when reason said otherwise. The ridge stayed quiet through the early morning, but the air in the shack felt heavier than before. Elias had kept his place near the doorway the entire night, bow resting across his knees, listening to the soft rasp of the woman's breathing. She slept in short, broken stretches, waking only long enough to drink a little water before exhaustion pulled her back under. When she finally opened her eyes again, a faint gray light filled the room. Her fever seemed lower, but the weakness in her limbs was still clear. She pushed herself upright slowly, one hand on the wall for balance. Elias turned enough to see her without crowding her. "You're awake," he said quietly. She nodded once, her eyes drifting to the blanket he had placed over her. The gesture seemed to confuse her. For a moment, she simply watched him, as if trying to understand why she was still alive. "You should drink," he said. He slid the canteen toward her. She reached for it with trembling fingers and took a careful sip. Her gaze shifted to the notebook in her lap. She held it close, her thumb brushing over the worn cover. Elias noticed again how protective she was of it. The tension in her shoulders suggested she expected him to take it at any moment. He didn't move. Instead, he addressed the silent question she had carried since the moment she woke. Who he was, why he helped, and what he intended to do with her. "My name is Elias Ward," he said. "I'm a scout. I'm not here to interrogate you, and I'm not here to hand you over." Her eyes tightened in disbelief. She scanned the room, then his face, searching for signs of deception. She couldn't find any, but trust didn't come easily. She swallowed and spoke in quiet, halting English. "You should kill me. Your army would." Elias shook his head. "You're not a threat to me, and you're in no condition to harm anyone." She lowered her gaze again, unsure how to respond. Behind her fear, there was something else, guilt, maybe shame. Elias could see it in the small tremor in her hands. "You were running," he said. "You didn't just get lost." She hesitated, torn between caution and the need to be understood. Her voice came out small but clear. "I was cryptographer. I worked with radio codes, officer transmissions. My unit ordered me to decode messages for an attack on civilians. I refused. They accused me of betrayal." A pause. Her fingers tightened on the notebook. "They came to kill me. I ran." It answered the unspoken questions left from the first day. Why she was alone, why she was hunted, and why she held that notebook so tightly. Elias felt a slow, steady anger build in him. Not at her, but the situation she had been forced into. "What's in the notebook?" he asked. She took a shaky breath. "Codes, movements, names, orders. Everything they do not want your army to know." This wasn't just evidence of disobedience. It was critical intelligence. Now her fear made perfect sense. She wasn't only running for survival. She carried something that could turn the war on this ridge. Elias leaned back against the wall, absorbing the information. "You do what you thought was right," he said. She shook her head. "Right does not matter. They will not stop." He didn't argue. She was right. If the officers tracking her believed she carried sensitive information, they would search every ridge and every village until they found her. He stood and stepped outside, scanning the jungle carefully. The rain had stopped, but the ground still held fresh boot marks. 2 sets, moving slowly along the lower path. Too close. Too purposeful. He returned to the doorway. There are patrols near the ridge. They're getting closer. Her breath caught. She pulled the blanket tight around herself, but she didn't panic the way she had the day before. She watched him instead, waiting to hear what he planned. Elias considered the situation quickly. She couldn't run. She couldn't fight, and the officers searching for her would eventually find the hut if he didn't redirect them. "We'll make the place look abandoned," he said. "If they get close, I'll deal with them before they see you." Her eyes widened. "You would fight for me?" He nodded once. "I'm not letting them take you." She lowered her head, emotion tightening her throat. She wasn't used to anyone standing between her and danger. As Elias checked his bowstring, she spoke again, her voice unsteady but honest. "I do not know why you help, but I am grateful." Elias didn't answer, not because he ignored her, but because the truth felt too personal to say out loud. He didn't help her out of strategy or orders. He helped her because walking away would have stayed with him forever. He stepped outside, moving silently down the ridge to prepare an intercept. Inside the shack, she pulled the blanket around her shoulders and watched the doorway, listening to the muffled sounds of the jungle. Her hands shook, not from fear this time, but from the strange, fragile relief that someone had chosen to protect her when he had every reason not to. For the first time since fleeing her unit, she wasn't waiting to die alone. Elias moved down the ridge with the same steady caution he used on every mission, but this time his focus was sharper. The boot marks he saw earlier were fresh, and they belonged to men who knew the terrain well. He followed the trail for several meters, staying low, listening for changes in movement or breathing patterns among the trees. The forest was still damp from the night's rain. Water dripped from branches in slow, heavy drops. The ground smelled of wet soil and decaying leaves. Elias controlled his breathing, staying completely silent. The bow rested easily in his hand, an old habit that gave him a sense of control. No shaking, no memories trying to drag him backward. Ahead, 2 Japanese officers appeared through the brush. Their uniforms were darker from moisture. They walked in a patient, deliberate formation, eyes moving, rifles angled low but ready. Their steps weren't hurried. They weren't searching randomly. They were tracking a direction, and Elias saw immediately that it led toward the shack. He positioned himself behind a tree trunk, waited for their approach, and steadied his grip. The first officer passed his hiding spot, scanning the left side of the ridge. Elias released the arrow the moment he exhaled. It struck cleanly, and the man collapsed without sound. The second officer only had time to widen his eyes before Elias struck again. The forest swallowed the noise of the bodies settling into the undergrowth. Elias checked their pockets. No radios, no written coordinates, only small maps marked with a rough search pattern. They weren't scouting randomly. They had a general idea of where Aiko had run. He dragged the bodies into a dense cluster of ferns, covered them with wet leaves, and wiped the arrowheads clean before returning to the ridge. Back at the shack, Aiko sat near the wall with the blanket wrapped tightly around her. Her breathing was slow and controlled, but her eyes kept flicking toward the door with a tension that hadn't faded. When she saw Elias step in alone, a wave of relief crossed her face before she could hide it. He set down his bow quietly. They were getting close. She looked at his hands, seeing the dampness on his sleeves, the faint marks of struggle. "You stopped them," she said softly. Elias nodded once. He didn't describe what happened. He didn't need to. She already understood what it meant. Aiko shifted her weight, pulling the notebook against her chest. "There will be more," she whispered. "The officer in charge, he won't stop. He is strict, loyal. He will come himself if others fail." This was the first time she mentioned a specific officer, and Elias recognized the fear behind her words. She wasn't hiding anything. She simply hadn't been strong enough earlier to talk about him. "Who is he?" Elias asked. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering herself. "Captain Satoru Ishida. My superior. He oversees code stations in this region. Very disciplined, very precise. He doesn't tolerate disobedience." A short pause. He led the execution orders. I refused to assist. The missing detail from before clicked into place. Not only was she valuable for her knowledge, but she had openly defied an officer known for ruthless efficiency. That explained why the search teams were so persistent and why the patrol patterns matched military discipline rather than desperation. Elias crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. He'll be here soon. Aiko nodded. He will look for footprints, broken branches, anything. Elias stepped outside again, inspecting the outer perimeter of the shack. Some mud had smeared where he dragged branches earlier. Nothing too visible, but Ishida would eventually notice the subtle signs. He returned inside. We need to be prepared. Aiko tightened the blanket. I can't run far. My legs are still weak. I'm not asking you to run. He knelt near the broken crate in the corner, checking the few supplies he had left. 2 small ration packets, dried vegetables, a flask with little water remaining. She watched him work, studying the efficient, almost methodical movements. After a moment, she spoke again. Why do you trust me? Elias paused, then continued inspecting his gear. I don't trust your army, but I trust what I see in front of me. She looked down at her hands. And what do you see? A woman who tried to stop something wrong and is paying for it. Her throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond, not with words. Instead, she set the notebook aside for the first time since he found her. She folded her hands in her lap, calm but tense. Outside, a distant crack echoed through the ridge, something heavy stepping on a wet branch. Elias froze instantly, listening. Another sound followed, metal brushing against metal, quiet but unmistakable. He moved to the window slit and looked out. For soldiers climbed the slope, rifles drawn, spacing tight. Behind them, stepping carefully and with confidence, came a man with a clean uniform and an officer's cap. His posture was rigid, his expression focused. His movements were measured, almost cold. Aiko saw the change in Elias's face before he even spoke. He's here, she whispered. Elias nodded. That must be Ishida. The soldiers spread out, checking trees and tracking prints with trained eyes. Ishida scanned the ridge with slow, calculating precision. He gestured toward the shack, and the group began moving toward it. Elias grabbed his bow and checked his arrows. Only 3 left. He moved toward the door. Stay low. Don't make a sound. No matter what happens, I'll handle them. Aiko's voice trembled. Please don't let them take me. I won't. He slipped outside before the patrol reached the clearing, disappearing into the brush with the same silent precision that kept him alive through every mission. His heartbeat steadied, his mind clearing as he prepared for what he knew would be the hardest fight yet. Inside the shack, Aiko pressed her back against the wall, gripping the blanket as her breath shook in her chest. But despite the fear rising in her, she felt something new, an instinctive belief that Elias would return. And on the ridge outside, moving through the wet leaves with controlled steps, Elias prepared to make sure she never went back to the life she ran from. Elias kept low to the ground as he moved through the soaked brush, circling wide to intercept the advancing soldiers. The air was thick with humidity, every breath bringing in the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. He counted 4 soldiers spreading out in a tightening arc, with the officer following behind them at a steady, confident pace. The officer's posture alone showed he was accustomed to giving orders that were followed without hesitation. Elias paused behind a tree trunk, checking the direction of their formation. They were closing in on the shack with careful precision, searching for any sign of recent movement. He tightened his grip on the bow. He had 3 arrows. That number stayed sharp in his mind, pressing on his nerves but not controlling him. He needed to use each one deliberately. One soldier stepped slightly ahead of the group, scanning the undergrowth. Elias steadied his breathing, drew the bowstring back, and released. The arrow struck cleanly, and the man dropped with only a muffled thud. Another soldier turned sharply, raising his rifle. Elias moved 2 steps to the right, drew again, and shot before the man could fire. The arrow hit him in the upper chest, knocking him back into the mud. The remaining 2 soldiers reacted quickly, firing into the trees where they thought Elias was hiding. Bullets tore splinters from the trunk near his head. He ducked behind a thick, vine-covered rock, repositioned, and scanned for movement. One of the soldiers crouched behind a fallen tree, searching for a target. Elias inhaled once, stepped out just enough to line up the shot, and released the third arrow. It struck with enough force to drop the soldier instantly. The last soldier shouted in warning, firing several rounds deep into the foliage. The shots were wild, rushed, desperate. With no arrows left, Elias moved silently to the side, lifted a stone the size of his fist, and threw it far into the opposite brush. The soldier reacted to the noise, turning and firing into the wrong direction. Elias closed the distance quickly. He tackled the man from behind, knocking the rifle out of reach. The mud made both of them slip, but Elias recovered first, pinning the soldier down and striking him hard across the jaw. The soldier went still. Only the officer remained. Elias rose and looked toward the clearing. Ishida stood near the doorway of the shack, pistol drawn, scanning the ridgeline. His attention was fixed on the forest, unaware that the men who had been protecting him were already down. Inside the shack, Aiko pressed her back against the wall, breathing through tight panic. She could hear the officer outside, his boots on the wooden threshold, the metal click of his pistol being cocked. Her hands shook as she tried to stay silent. The notebook clutched so tightly it pressed in her ribs. Ishida stepped inside with controlled, deliberate movements. His eyes swept the room and stopped on her immediately. His jaw tightened, and he raised the pistol. She froze, unable to speak or move, every muscle locking from fear. Elias reached the doorway, just as Ishida stepped toward her. He entered fast, crossing the distance before the officer could fully turn toward him. Ishida fired once, the bullet grazing the wooden beam above Aiko's head. Elias grabbed the officer's wrist, slamming it against the wall. The pistol clattered to the floor. Ishida fought back with surprising force, pulling Elias forward by his collar and driving a knee into his stomach. Elias felt the air leave his lungs, but he didn't release his grip. He forced Ishida's arm down, and the two crashed against the side of the shack. The impact sent dust and splinters falling from the ceiling. Ishida reached for a knife strapped to his belt, but Elias pinned his forearm before the blade could be drawn. Aiko watched with wide, terrified eyes, unable to tear her gaze away from the struggle. Elias shifted his weight and drove his shoulder into Ishida's chest, slamming him back against a wooden post. The officer tried to regain his footing, teeth clenched, breath sharp with anger. Elias struck him once across the jaw, then again. The second blow made Ishida stumble, and Elias seized the moment, pulling him forward and knocking him to the ground. The officer reached for the pistol lying a few feet away, his fingers stretching toward it. Elias kicked it aside, then pressed his knee into Ishida's ribs, holding him down. The officer's strength weakened with each second, his breathing turning shallow and fractured. Elias ended the fight with one final strike across the side of Ishida's head. The officer went limp, his body settling heavily into the dirt floor. Silence filled the shack, broken only by Aiko's unsteady breaths. Elias stayed still for a moment, catching his own breath, his chest rising and falling with the leftover adrenaline. When he finally looked at her, she hadn't moved from the corner. Her hands trembled, but her eyes stayed locked on him, filled with shock, fear, and something more restrained, relief. He stepped toward her slowly. "It's over," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in his muscles. "He won't come after you again." Aiko exhaled shakily, her shoulders lowering as if the weight of days finally loosened. She didn't speak at first. She simply reached out with a small, hesitant movement and touched his forearm, needing the reassurance that he was real, that the danger was truly gone. Elias didn't pull away. He stood close enough for her to feel that he wasn't preparing to leave or to hand her over to anyone. "We can't stay here," he said quietly. "They'll send more when he doesn't report in." Aiko nodded, still trying to steady her hands. The fear in her face hadn't vanished, but now it was mixed with trust. Trust built not from promises, but from the fact that he had returned for her again and again. Elias checked the remaining supplies and slung his quiver over his shoulder, empty but still useful. He stepped toward the door and looked out into the quiet ridge. "We leave at first light," he said. "You're not being hunted anymore. Not alone." Aiko gathered the blanket around her shoulders and stood, legs unsteady but determined. She walked toward him, stopping just behind his shoulder as they looked out at the jungle together. The shack had kept them alive for a short time, but the ridge ahead would decide everything. The sky began to lighten before the sun reached the ridge, casting a muted gray glow across the wet jungle. Elias stepped outside first, checking the surroundings with careful eyes. The forest felt quieter than the day before. No distant voices, no shifting brush, no signs of remaining patrols. The air carried only the sound of dripping leaves and the soft hum of insects waking with the morning. Aiko stood just inside the doorway, holding the blanket around her shoulders. Her face still showed the exhaustion of the past days, but there was a steadiness in her expression that hadn't been there before. She stepped toward him and stopped at his side, waiting for his signal. "We moved down toward the valley," he said. "American patrols pass through there." She nodded. The idea of meeting American soldiers tightened her breath, but she knew staying on the ridge meant death. She adjusted the strap of her notebook bag and followed Elias as he led her into the thick foliage. The descent was slow. Mud made the slopes slippery, and Aiko's strength was still limited. Elias checked on her often, offering his arm when she needed to steady herself. She accepted his help quietly, each time with a brief glance that carried gratitude she couldn't fully voice. As they walked, the ridge opened into a wider path where faint boot tracks marked recent movement. Aiko stopped for a moment, scanning them with worry. "American?" she asked. "Yes," Elias said. "They're heading in this direction." She tightened her grip on the notebook. "Will they believe me?" The fear in her voice wasn't loud, but real. Elias stepped closer, lowering his voice. "They won't lay a hand on you. I'll speak for you." Her expression softened at the certainty in his tone, as if the promise alone gave her strength. She took a breath and continued walking. By mid-morning, they reached the lower valley. A rusted water drum and scattered shell casings showed signs of previous skirmishes, but the area was quiet now. Elias listened carefully and caught the faint sound of distant American voices carried by the wind. He raised his hand, signaling Aiko to stop behind him. Moments later, a small U.S. patrol emerged from the trees. 3 soldiers in faded uniforms, rifles relaxed at their sides. Their surprise at seeing Elias was clear. "Ward, we thought you were further south," one of them said. Elias kept his stance firm. "I found someone who needs protection. Don't point your weapons at her." The men lowered their rifles immediately when they saw Aiko step out from behind Elias, her hands visible, her posture tense but not threatening. Her notebook hung at her side, the straps worn from days of being held too tightly. One soldier hesitated. She's Japanese. What's going on?" "She deserted," Elias said. "She carries intelligence that'll help command. She's not a prisoner. She's under my protection." The tone left no room for debate. The patrol leader studied Aiko's exhausted face, then looked at the notebook she carried. Whatever doubts, he had faded as he recognized the value of the codes. He nodded. "We'll escort you both back to the forward camp." Relief washed over Aiko, soaked suddenly that her knees weakened. Elias stepped closer, steadying her with one hand at her elbow. The patrol guided them toward the camp, a makeshift base of tents and scattered equipment. Medical staff moved quickly when they saw Aiko's condition. She was taken into a canvas-covered aid tent, where a medic checked her fever and offered her clean water. She glanced at Elias as she was led inside, her expression filled with both fear and trust. He gave her a small nod. Hours passed before she was brought out again, wrapped in a clean blanket, her hair washed, her breathing steadier. An American intelligence officer approached Elias, holding the decoded pages Aiko had provided. The man's expression showed how serious the information was. "This will save lives," he said quietly. "We'll arrange protection for her. She won't be harmed." Elias thanked him with a small, tired nod. When Aiko walked toward him, her steps still slow but more confident, she stopped only a few inches away. There were no soldiers chasing her now. No ridge to hide on. No officer ready to drag her back. Just the quiet relief of safety. You stayed, she said. Elias held her gaze. I told you I would. She looked down, gripping the blanket with both hands. I want to go where you go, if that is allowed. He didn't answer immediately. He studied her face, still pale, still marked with strain. But there was a clarity in her eyes, a calm he hadn't seen before. She wasn't asking out of fear. She was asking because he had become the one person she trusted after losing everything else. You can come with me, he said. You're safe now. Her shoulders loosened, and she let out a breath that sounded like letting go of weeks of terror. She stepped closer, standing beside him with a small but certain movement. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, they walked away from the aid tent together, heading toward the transport trucks waiting to move personnel to safer ground. Iko stayed close, matching her steps with his. Elias kept a steady pace, letting her know without words that he wasn't going anywhere. The ridge, the shack, the pursuit, all of it faded behind them as they walked toward the future side by side. There was no uncertainty left. She wasn't alone. He wasn't walking away. And for the first time since either of their lives had fallen apart, they stepped forward not as strangers, but as two people who had chosen to stay with one another.